The rain had already soaked through the tent seams by midnight, and when the second sleeping bag zipper jammed beyond repair, Daniel realized there was no way around it. He and Maya, his best friend of 12 years, would have to share the only dry bag left, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the dark, breathing the same cold mountain air, while something unspoken between them finally refused to stay quiet any longer. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the kind of love that grows quietly before either person notices it, hit like, drop a comment, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Whispered Maybe, because tonight's story might just remind you of someone you never told the truth to. Daniel Cole had known Maya Bennett since they were 14 years old, sitting in the back row of a chemistry class neither of them cared about, trading notes about music instead of formulas. Over the years, their friendship had become the kind of steady, dependable thing that people build their lives around without ever questioning it. She was the first person he called when his father passed away during his sophomore year of college. He was the one who sat with her in a hospital waiting room when her brother was in a car accident, holding her hand until dawn without either of them saying a word. They had built a friendship out of showing up, again and again, in the moments that mattered most, and somewhere along the way Daniel had convinced himself that this was simply what they were, two people who loved each other in the safest, most uncomplicated way two people could. He told himself that every time his chest tightened when she laughed at something he said. He told himself that every time he caught himself staring a second too long at the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. He buried it, packed it away in some quiet corner of himself, because the fear of losing her as a friend felt so much larger than the ache of wanting her as something more. Maya was too important, too permanent, too woven into the fabric of his life for him to risk it on a feeling he wasn't even sure was real. So for years he simply loved her the way he was allowed to, from a careful distance, dressed up as friendship, never once letting the mask slip. The camping trip had been Maya's idea, a tradition they'd kept since college, an annual escape into the mountains where cell service disappeared and the noise of their separate lives went quiet for a weekend. This year, though, something about the trip felt different before it even began. Maya had just ended a 2-year relationship 3 months earlier, and Daniel had watched her rebuild herself piece by piece, watched the light slowly return to her eyes after weeks of dimness. He hadn't dated anyone seriously in over a year himself, though he never told her the real reason why, that no one else had ever quite measured up to a standard he refused to admit was shaped entirely around her. They'd hiked 6 miles into the backcountry that afternoon, setting up camp beside a river that caught the last gold light of the afternoon sun, laughing about nothing in particular, the kind of easy laughter that only exists between people who have run out of things to prove to each other. It was the kind of day that felt suspended outside of time, and Daniel remembered thinking, somewhere around sunset, that he could live inside that single afternoon forever and never ask for anything else. But then the sky changed. Clouds rolled in faster than either of them expected, and by the time the first heavy drops began to fall, they were already soaked, scrambling to secure the tent against a storm that hadn't been in any forecast. They managed to get everything inside just as the rain turned into a full downpour, thunder rolling across the ridge above them, and it was only once they were zipped inside, breathless and laughing at their own bad luck, that they realized the second sleeping bag zipper had torn clean through the fabric, useless against the cold. The temperature was already dropping fast, the kind of mountain cold that crept into your bones within minutes, and there was only one dry sleeping bag left, large enough barely, for 2 people who were used to sharing everything except this. Neither of them said much as they climbed in together, the tent shrinking around them, the storm outside turning the world into a wall of sound. Daniel lay stiffly at first, achingly aware of every point where their bodies touched, the warmth of her back against his chest, the rhythm of her breathing slowing as the adrenaline of the storm wore off. He stared up at the fabric ceiling of the tent, listening to rain hammer against nylon, trying to quiet the thundering of his own heart, telling himself this meant nothing, that this was simply survival. 2 friends keeping each other warm the way they always had in every other sense. But then Maya shifted slightly, turning over so she was facing him in the near total darkness, close enough that he could feel her breath against his jaw, and she asked, quietly, almost hesitantly, "Are you awake?" And something about the way she said it, some fragile uncertainty in her voice that he had never heard from her before, told him this wasn't a question about sleep at all. He said yes, barely above a whisper, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavier than the storm outside. Then Maya said something that would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. She told him she'd been having a recurring thought for months, ever since her relationship ended. A thought she'd been too afraid to say out loud because saying it might change everything between them. She told him that in the quiet moments, in the middle of the night when her mind wandered without permission, it was always his face she saw, always his voice she wanted to hear. And she was terrified that she'd ruined the best friendship of her life by finally admitting it. Daniel lay there in the dark, feeling something crack open inside his chest, years of carefully buried feeling rising up all at once, and for a moment he couldn't speak at all, because he was afraid that if he opened his mouth, everything he'd hidden for over a decade would come pouring out faster than he could control. When he finally found his voice, it was shaking, and he told her the truth he'd never let himself say, that he had loved her since he was 17 years old, that he'd watched her fall in love with other people and smiled through it because her happiness mattered more to him than his own, that he'd told himself for years it was safer to keep her as a friend than to risk losing her entirely by wanting more. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded, and for a moment Daniel braced himself for the awkwardness he was certain would follow, the careful backpedaling, the reassurances that they could go back to normal. Instead, Maya reached out in the darkness and found his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and told him that she didn't want to go back to normal. She told him she was tired of being careful, tired of losing years to fear, tired of watching him from a distance and calling it friendship when it had always felt like so much more. They didn't kiss that night. It felt too fragile for that, too important to rush, as if speaking the truth out loud had already changed something sacred between them that neither wanted to disturb too quickly. Instead, they simply lay there in the dark, tangled together against the cold, talking in hushed voices until the storm passed and the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the tent walls. They talked about every year they'd wasted being afraid, every moment they'd almost said something and pulled back at the last second, every relationship they'd both settled into because it was easier than risking what they had for each other. By the time the sun rose fully over the ridge, something between them had shifted permanently, quietly, the way a single choice can rearrange the entire shape of a life without anyone else even noticing it happened. The weeks that followed weren't without their fears. Daniel worried constantly that he'd imagined the depth of what happened that night, that daylight and normal life would erase whatever fragile thing had been born in that tent. Maya worried that their friends and families, who had always seen them as a unit but never as a couple, wouldn't understand how something platonic for 12 years could become something else entirely. There were nights when old insecurities crept back in, when Daniel caught himself waiting for her to change her mind, to tell him this had been a mistake born of storm and proximity and nothing more. But every time that fear surfaced, Maya was there to meet it, choosing him again in small, steady ways, a hand reaching for his in public without hesitation, a quiet admission to her mother that she was finally dating her best friend, a certainty in her voice whenever she spoke about their future that slowly taught Daniel to stop bracing for loss and start trusting in what they'd built. It wasn't a fairy tale transformation. It was slower than that, more human than that. There were arguments about how to navigate the shift from friendship to partnership, moments of clumsy uncertainty about boundaries that had never existed before, growing pains that came from trying to build something new on top of 12 years of established history. But underneath all of it was a foundation neither of them had to question, a friendship so deeply rooted that it made the romance that grew from it feel less like a risk and more like an inevitability they'd simply been too afraid to claim sooner. A year after that storm, Daniel proposed to her in the same spot beside the river, on the same camping trip they'd taken every year since college, though this time the sky stayed clear and full of stars. He told her, kneeling in the dirt with his hand shaking, that he never wanted to spend another night wondering if she was awake, wondering if she felt what he felt, because he intended to spend the rest of his life falling asleep beside her and waking up certain of her love every single morning after. Maya said yes before he even finished the question, both of them laughing and crying at once, the same river running beside them that had once witnessed the moment everything changed. Looking back now, Daniel understands that the fear he carried for over a decade, the fear that kept him silent, was never really protecting anything. It was only delaying what was always meant to happen, costing them years they could have spent choosing each other sooner. But he also believes, in the quieter moments, that maybe some love needs that long, slow build, needs the trust of a lifelong friendship to make the leap into something more feel safe enough to survive. Maya likes to say that the storm that ruined their sleeping bag was the best thing that ever happened to them because it forced them into a closeness they'd both been avoiding, stripped away every excuse they'd been hiding behind, and left them with nothing to do but finally tell the truth. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone you've been too afraid to tell the truth to, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And before you go, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We would love to know how far this story has traveled and how many hearts it's reached tonight.